It is 2007, and Garda detective Alan Bailey is in the Garda archive in Santry, on the north side of Dublin. He is looking for something very particular. He is part of the newly formed Garda Serious Crime Review Team, better known as the Cold Case Unit. Their job is to seek the answers to homicides that have remained unsolved for decades. They are going to peer into cases where answers and justice once seemed impossible. But they need to find the right one. The Cold Case Unit have to pick their battles. There are over 200 unsolved homicides open to them to investigate, going back to 1980. Everything from gangland shootings to random attacks on the street. Bailey knows they can't solve each of these tragedies from the past. They're a small team of just 8 detectives. They must sift through the records and weigh up the odds on each one. They need to find the right case. That has brought them to the archive room, and it is row after row of shelves, each stacked with boxes. There are countless cases, an unknown number of stories. Alan is looking for the stories that never got an ending. Each box is filled with manila folders containing case files. They are sorted by year. Alan goes along the aisles, moving year by year, walking further into the past. He reaches 1981. He stops. He is not searching aimlessly. He has been told there is something here he should seek out, a case with no end, and one that needs to be concluded. He goes through the boxes and folders, all filed alphabetically. He hits S. He opens the box. He pulls out the folder, flicks it open, and begins to read. A murder in County Cork 26 years ago. Nora Sheehan. Bailey reads on. He is assessing every part of the file methodically to allow him to make his calculation. Is this the case they've been searching for? He reads witness statements. He pores over the evidence. He delves into the whole story from almost 3 decades ago. He sees it all. Nora waving at passing cars on that June night. The desperate search and her terrible end. He feels a sadness, thinking of her there on the side of the road with her bandaged arm. A dog bite, pure chance, and a trip to the hospital. And then an encounter with someone. The wrong place, the wrong time. He reads of a suspect who never faced a trial, who walked away smirking at Gardaí. And then Bailey spots something critical. A slide of DNA was taken from the crime scene. It was no use to the investigators in 1981, but that was a very different time. Could they find it and test it again? Would it unlock the truth of who killed Nora Sheehan? Bailey sees the precious slide of DNA is stored today in a Department of Justice facility in North Dublin. He has found his case. When a person is killed in Ireland, the Gardaí turn to the forensic examiners of the Technical Bureau. For 25 years I was one of them. I'm John Sweetman. At crime scenes I learned to listen to what the evidence was saying and what the killer was trying to silence. A smudged print, a misplaced everyday object, the smallest detail that revealed the truth. Now in this new GoLoud original podcast, I return to some of Ireland's most compelling cases. This is Lines of Inquiry, a podcast that follows the evidence and reveals the story behind each case. In this episode, we continue the story of the murder of Nora Sheehan, a Cork woman whose death in 1981 led to one of Ireland's longest unresolved cases. It is a case that fell apart at first, only for a new investigation to be reignited over 4 decades later, with one last chance to finally deliver justice. This is Lines of Inquiry, The Murder of Nora Sheehan, Part 2. As Noel Long walked free in November of 1981, Nora Sheehan's family faced a new nightmare laid upon the one they had been living since her brutal murder earlier that year. They had to watch as cruel twists of fate, with the death of the state pathologist and a Garda investigator, pulled justice from their hands. It seemed Noel Long would never have to face his day in court and answer the accusation he was the man who murdered Nora Sheehan. Nora's husband James, in particular, struggled after his wife's death and the collapse of the case. He would pass away just a few years later in 1985, never seeing justice done. The case went cold, years turned into decades. Noel Long continued with his life. He accumulated more run-ins with the law, assaults and other offences, but never again was he charged with murder. The following year, a woman from Dublin was hitchhiking to Kinsale and accepted the offer of a lift from a man driving a mint green Volkswagen camper van. The man took the woman to a car park in Kinsale, beat her and attempted to strangle her before raping her. As they heard the woman's description of the attacker and his van, Gardaí were in no doubt. Noel Long drove a mint green Volkswagen camper van, and Gardaí in Cork knew he was their prime suspect. But the woman was so traumatised at the awful attack that she chose not to proceed with the case and left for the UK. Once again, Gardaí were denied the chance to make Long answer for a horrific crime. For decades, the evidence from the 1981 murder of Nora Sheehan lay dormant in storage. The fibres, the paint samples, and that potentially precious microscope slide with the swab of semen. All of it kept in storage, in hope as much as anything else. Nora's 3 sons continued their lives, raising their own families and forging their own path, but always carrying the memory of their mother with them. The memory of her and the weight of being left without answers or justice. For her family, her friends and the local community, there was always the hope that someday the truth would be found for Nora. But as 20 years turned into 30, before melting into 40, hope dissipated that she would ever get justice. But the hope never disappeared. In August of 2007, the Garda Commissioner established the Serious Crime Review Team. The team was set up to look into all unresolved homicides in Ireland since 1980, and the hope was that advances in DNA technology could help crack open some of those long-shuttered cases. It was in the weeks and months after the founding of the Cold Case Unit that Detective Alan Bailey and his colleagues undertook the job of identifying which homicides they should look at first. And the death of Nora Sheehan was one of the very first they took on. They knew the slide of DNA, collected 27 years ago, could prove critical to their chances of success. In November of 2008, Garda Detective Pádraig Hanley visited the Forensic Science Ireland labs and collected the slide of DNA, the semen sample retrieved from a swab taken from Nora's body. The sample within was tiny and degraded, but Gardaí in the Cold Case Unit hoped it could still hold critical evidence. Hanley then travelled to the airport and took a flight to Birmingham, where he would deliver the small yet precious package to a world-renowned scientist who specialised in this type of DNA profiling. His name was Dr. Jonathan Whittaker, and he was an expert in a recently developed and specialised method called low copy number DNA profiling, which had been developed to extract profiles from old or minute DNA samples. Dr. Whittaker took the slide and set about working to see if he could pull a genetic profile from the near 30-year-old sample. In the early part of 2009, Dr. Whittaker phoned Gardaí in Dublin. He had succeeded in generating a partial male profile. It wasn't a full set of genetic markers, but enough points of comparison to potentially identify a suspect if they got a reference sample of that suspect's DNA. This could change everything, but it was not assured. In 2008, armed with that potential DNA profile, the Cold Case team compared it against whatever known samples they had of Noel Long's DNA. And indeed, they did have Noel Long's DNA available. Gardaí had taken a blood sample in the 1981 investigation. When that blood was tested, it matched the partial DNA profile from the semen. Gardaí knew then what they had always suspected. The semen on Nora Sheehan's body had come from Noel Long. But even then, the path forward wasn't clear. Noel Long's blood sample from 1981 was legally an issue. It was obtained while he was in custody under a law that, as it turned out, was improperly used for a murder case. He was detained under a statute for questioning about a different crime, the Offences Against the State Act, when he was arrested seemingly in connection with a post office robbery. But in reality, that was no more than a tactic used by the Gardaí to allow them to detain and question him. The judge would likely rule that blood evidence was inadmissible because his detention was unlawful for the murder questioning. Indeed, the Gardaí got legal advice that they could not use Noel Long's 1981 blood sample in court. They would need a fresh, lawfully obtained DNA sample from Long to make their case. The cold case team worked the case for another 7 years, slowly piecing together whatever they could. In 2016, they passed the case to Gardaí in Bandon, County Cork, who took it on and continued the investigation. As they sought to put the case to rest at last, they faced a question. They had a DNA match for Noel Long, but no DNA sample of his that would stand up in court. So how could they get a new sample? In 2021, investigators quietly began surveillance and planning. Noel Long, now in his 70s, was still living in Cork. On the surface, he was an elderly man in poor health. He was not someone who would willingly give a DNA sample if asked. The Gardaí decided to use a search warrant strategy. In October 2021, they secured a warrant related to Nora's case and searched Long's home in Passage West, County Cork. During that search, among other items, they picked up a beanie hat that Long used regularly. Forensic testing of the hat yielded his DNA profile as expected, and crucially, when that profile was compared to the partial profile from the semen sample taken from Nora's body, it was a match. Despite being incomplete, experts estimated the probability of the DNA from the crime scene belonging to someone other than Noel Long was about 1 in 23,000. By early 2022, investigators had reconstructed a case that was, in many ways, even stronger than what existed back in 1981. They had the original fibre and paint evidence reaffirmed and decoded by modern experts, linking Long's car to Nora and proving beyond doubt that she'd been in the Opel Kadett. They had DNA evidence linking Long to the sexual assault on Nora. This time there would be no ambiguity or room for doubt. The case would focus on the clear evidence of an assault and Long's connection to it. On the morning of June 28, 2022, Noel Long was planning a trip to Portugal, a bike trip on his prized possession, a Harley-Davidson. Gardaí arrived at his home in Passage West, County Cork that same morning to arrest him for the 1981 murder of Nora Sheehan. Long showed little reaction when Gardaí called to his mid-terraced house at Maulbon shortly before 8 a.m. and arrested the 73-year-old for the murder of Nora Sheehan. Over 4 decades had passed since Nora's life was taken, and now at last her alleged killer was being brought before the courts. For Nora's family, her 3 sons and now even grandchildren, it was a day they sometimes feared might never come. There was a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The case still had to go to trial and Long, maintaining his innocence, would surely fight the charges. But the family's resolve was strong. They'd waited so long and endured so much heartache. And so, in the summer of 2023, the case was put before a jury. 42 years after Nora Sheehan was killed, the oldest murder trial ever brought before an Irish court was about to begin. What happened next would finally decide whether justice would be served, or if an evil killer got away with murder for the second time. Over 42 years had passed since Nora Sheehan's death by the time Noel Long went on trial at the Central Criminal Court in Dublin. It was a sight few could have imagined in 1981. Noel Long, now a frail 74-year-old man with grey hair, sitting in the dock to be judged for a murder committed when he was 32. This case made Irish legal history. It was the longest span ever between the act of carrying out a murder and the conviction of the killer. Journalists noted the significance. A 42-year-old cold case finally getting its day in court. But inside the courtroom, the fear lingered that any small misstep could mean justice would never be served. Before the trial could begin, there were weeks of legal argument over what could and couldn't be put before the jury. The court decided they would not hear of Long's long list of other crimes, the suspicions of a rape of a woman in Kinsale in 1982, or the charge he faced for indecently assaulting a woman with special needs at her home in 1989. Long was alleged to have called to her house and asked for a glass of water before attacking her. The case fell apart when the victim, who had poor verbal skills, couldn't be cross-examined, leading the DPP to abandon the case. The judge would not hear of how, in 2011, Long had assaulted his own sister, Julianne Moore, at Cork University Hospital. He attacked her at the bedside of their dying mother. After the trial, Long's sisters would detail just how brutal their brother had been, how he physically, emotionally and financially abused them and their elderly mother. They spoke to Nicola Talent's Beast podcast and laid bare the grim and terrifying reality of living life tethered to him. His own sisters would say he was evil, just evil. And then there was the 2013 assault of a man outside Long's home in Cork. Long sprayed the man with a garden hose, and when the man questioned him about it, Long beat him over the head with an iron bar. It was a story with many chapters of a man who continued to offend and seemed to be able to get away with it almost every time. Whether it was the unexpected death of the state pathologist in 81, the terrified victim who chose to flee rather than face her attacker again in 82, or the woman who could not testify about what was done to her in 89, every time Noel Long seemed to find a way out. None of that story would be heard in court, but it was known to those closest to the case, and it all built to a deep need to see him face justice at last. Modern advances in science were the headline of the prosecution's case, but at its heart were the same people who had been there in 1981. In putting together the case, the DPP had gone back to the investigators and witnesses who had helped piece together the case in those first few months after Nora's death. All these years later, the court would hear from many of them. Many were elderly now, some in their 90s, and they all took to the stand to recall those memories imprinted in their minds even decades later. They included Agnes Rice, the nurse who had treated Nora at the hospital on the last night she was seen alive, and Garda John O'Sullivan, who had beaten his way through the briars to reach Nora's body on that warm summer's afternoon. There was Joan Holland, who saw Nora waving at passing cars that fateful night. The court heard from retired detective Matthew Thorne, who had stopped Noel Long in his car in the days after Nora was found. There were the scientists who had examined the evidence pulled from Long's car, and the Gardaí who had found it. There was Tess Hogan, who had worked for years with state pathologist Dr. Robert Coakley. She was able to tell the court that yes, that was his handwriting in the original post-mortem report, the one that Dr. Coakley never got the chance to present himself. And there was retired Garda Danny Harrington, who almost 3 decades later recalled the day Nora's husband and son, James and James Jr., had called into him at Toker Garda Station to report their missing wife and mother. He told the court how he still remembered the younger man breaking down in tears. Together it was a vivid and detailed retelling of those few fateful days. With these testimonies, the prosecution, led by Brendan Grehan, SC, carefully laid out the story for the jury. Piece by piece, they reconstructed what happened to Nora Sheehan in June 1981. They explained how Nora had been a vulnerable woman. She had her eccentricities, but she was harmless, kind, decent and trusting. She was picked up while trying to hitch a lift home, having been injured earlier that night while intervening in a fight between 2 dogs. They described the discovery of her body in Shippool Woods, emphasising the telltale signs of foul play, the ragged state of her clothing and the bruises, indicating that she had been attacked and left in remote woods. Importantly, the prosecution did not rely on proving an exact cause of death. Going back to when she was discovered, the medical examiner at the time couldn't say with certainty which of the injuries were the fatal blow. Instead, they argued that all the circumstances clearly pointed to Nora having met her death at the hands of Noel Long during a violent sexual assault. Then came the forensic evidence, the cornerstone of this trial and what amounted to a smoking gun in modern parlance. Decades of technological progress were summed up for the jury. Scientists testified that a partial DNA profile had been generated from semen found inside Nora's body, and that this DNA matched Noel Long's DNA with a high degree of probability. An expert from Forensic Science Ireland and Dr. John Whittaker from the UK explained how the semen slide from 1981 was tested and how the match was made to DNA from Long's woolly hat in 2021. The jury heard that the chance of the semen coming from someone unrelated to Noel Long was effectively 0. In other words, it was his semen beyond any reasonable doubt. Next, the prosecution revisited the meticulous work of 1981's investigators. Forensic analyst Dr. Maureen Smith took the stand to recount her findings of fibres and paint linking Nora's clothing to Noel Long's Opel Kadett. She described the matching black carpet fibres found on Nora's coat, dress, tights, and even under her fingernails. Another expert, Dr. Sheila Willis, spoke about the paint fragments, how the blue paint on Nora's shoe had a unique 3-layer composition that matched the paint from Long's car, layer for layer. All these details, the prosecution argued, were like forensic breadcrumbs leading straight to Noel Long. It was as if Nora herself had managed to grab tiny pieces of her killer's car during the struggle, pieces that told her story decades later. One particularly compelling moment for the jury was when the prosecution summarised the evidence, leaving everyone who crammed into the court in little doubt of what happened. Noel Long had been in the same area as Nora when she went missing. Noel Long's car carried traces from Nora's clothes. Noel Long's semen was found in Nora's body. Combined, these facts pointed to what the state called the inescapable conclusion that Noel Long was the man who had raped and murdered Nora Sheehan. In his closing speech, the prosecutor urged the jurors to consider how all these independent pieces of evidence interlocked. He reminded them that Nora's body, left partially naked and bruised far from home, spoke of a crime committed with intent and malice. This was no procession, though, and the defence, of course, fought back vigorously. They would raise doubts about the DNA evidence and the reliability of memories 42 years old. They would seek to make the jury question everything. The end was nearing, but what it would be was not clear. Noel Long pleaded not guilty, and his senior counsel, Michael Delaney SC, sought to sow doubt in the prosecution case wherever he could. The defence team aimed to raise doubts around the reliability of modern-day DNA techniques used to extract a profile from the slide of semen, which would likely prove central to the case. The defence told the court the technique in question, low copy number profiling, was not without its detractors or controversies. The jury heard of how the technique was suspended from being used in the UK in 2007 after a judge at a trial related to the Omagh bombing had doubts about it. A later review found there was no reason to doubt the validity of this technique, but did suggest refining the process. The defence counsel told the jury the technique was no longer in use and had only been used in a limited way in the UK, leaving them to consider their own views on how much trust to place in the evidence it provided. If they were swayed, even to a small degree of doubt, it could see the case against Noel Long fall apart. One of the defence's other main angles was the question of murder versus a lesser crime. Since the pathologist from 1981 was deceased, and the cause of death was officially recorded as unascertained, the defence argued that the prosecution had not proven beyond reasonable doubt that Nora was intentionally killed. They wanted the jury to come away thinking that she could have died accidentally or in a panic during the violent rape. They acknowledged that a sexual assault likely took place. They could hardly dispute it, the evidence of that was undeniable, but they suggested a range of alternative scenarios for the jury to consider, all of which would point away from murder. The former state pathologist, Professor Mary Cassidy, who had reviewed the case in 2010, was called by the defence. She testified that there was no evidence Nora was strangled in a classic way. The telltale neck fracture wasn't there. The hyoid bone, a horseshoe-shaped bone in the neck that is frequently broken by the immense pressure applied during strangulation, was intact. There was no petechial hemorrhages in the eyes. Dr. Cassidy agreed that one cannot 100% exclude the possibility that Nora's death was due to cardiac arrhythmia, or in layman's terms a heart attack, brought on by the stress of an assault, or that she could have been smothered by having her face forced into bedding, if the assault happened elsewhere and Nora was then brought to where the body was found. Essentially, the defence was saying, yes, something horrific happened to Nora, but you can't be sure it was murder. They urged the jury that if they had any doubt about intent, they should acquit on the murder charge and perhaps consider manslaughter at most. The defence also highlighted the extraordinary delay in bringing the case to trial. They filed motions to stop the trial entirely due to undue delay, arguing that Noel Long's ability to defend himself was compromised by the passage of 42 years, and Long should not face trial because memories fade, some witnesses were dead, and evidence might be lost. The trial judge, Mr. Justice Paul McDermott, had already ruled that the delay, while lengthy, did not prejudice Long's right to a fair trial given the strength and nature of the evidence available. The jury was not told about many aspects of Long's past or the initial 1981 investigation's twists. They didn't hear that Long had been charged and the charge dropped back then due to the death of the pathologist. They never knew about his previous convictions for sexual offences either, and they didn't hear about the interview Long gave to Gardaí on the day he was charged, when he claimed he was beaten and abused by detectives. They also did not hear that Long had supposedly confessed to the crime that day. That information was kept from them to ensure they judged only on the evidence admissible in the case. For the members of the jury, it ultimately came down to the scientific evidence versus the theoretical doubts posed by the defence. After hearing weeks of testimony, they retired to deliberate. They considered their decision for 5 hours and 32 minutes. On August 4, 2023, the jurors returned with their decision. In a unanimous verdict, they found Noel Long guilty of the murder of Nora Sheehan. The foreman's voice announcing guilty rang through the courtroom. In the public gallery, Nora's family grasped each other's hands and wept, a mixture of relief, grief and triumph washing over them. Across the aisle, Noel Long showed little visible reaction as his decades-long secret was finally laid bare. Due to the conviction, the mandatory penalty was a life sentence. Justice McDermott spoke before sentencing. Given the unusual nature of the case, he noted the historic span of time and commended the persistence of the Gardaí and forensic specialists in pursuing the truth. He then addressed Noel Long directly. Here was a man who had lived a full life in freedom, walking the same streets as Nora's grieving family, all while bearing responsibility for a horrific crime. The judge's voice hardened as he emphasised the brutality of what Long had done to Nora and the additional cruelty of letting her family suffer for decades without closure. Mr. Justice McDermott formally imposed the life imprisonment on 74-year-old Noel Long, and for the record, backdated it by a few weeks to account for the time already spent in custody awaiting trial. In practical terms, it meant Noel Long will likely spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. It was justice delayed, but finally served. Outside the courthouse, the Sheehan family spoke to reporters amid emotional scenes. They had prepared a victim impact statement that was read in court, in which they addressed Nora directly as well as Noel Long. We never gave up hoping that one day we would get justice for you, and we hope we have done you proud, the family statement to Nora read. Her children and grandchildren expressed how the shadow of her unsolved murder had loomed over their lives for 42 years. Every family gathering, every Christmas, an empty chair at the table broke their heart. Their sadness, compounded by everyone knowing the man responsible, was free as a bird. Nora's sister, Sadie, spoke with raw emotion. She had heard the news of an unidentified woman's body on the radio back in 1981, only to learn it was her beloved sister. Now at the verdict, Sadie's words for Noel Long were scathing. "I just hope he rots in hell for what he did," she said tearfully. The anger and pain of 42 years were visceral. There was also a sense of peace finally descending on the family. Nora's granddaughter, Katie, said softly, "We hope you are at peace now, Mum." In their statement, they told Nora that her husband James, their father and grandfather, had never recovered from her death. He died a few years later of a broken heart as much as anything. But now, they said, perhaps he and Nora could both rest peacefully knowing that justice had been done. The family thanked the Gardaí, the forensic scientists and the prosecutors for never giving up. They held up a framed photograph of Nora, a black and white picture of a smiling woman who would forever be 54, and said this verdict was for her. The impact of Nora Sheehan's case rippled beyond her own family. This became a watershed case in Ireland for cold case prosecutions. It proved that time and technology can converge to solve even the longest of mysteries. The fight for justice should never end. It was the oldest murder prosecution in Irish history, and a landmark for forensic science and the justice system. The Garda Serious Crime Review Team's success in Nora's case has given hope to other families of unsolved murders. If a 1981 case can be solved in 2023, then perhaps other cold cases, once thought impossible to crack, might also one day see justice served. Investigators also took a moment to acknowledge the importance of preserving evidence. The microscopic slide of semen that Dr. Creedon saved in 1981 became the key to the entire case. Had that evidence not been preserved with care, Noel Long might never have been convicted. It was a lesson in the evolution of science, how diligent evidence handling today can lead to justice decades later. Forensic experts around the country quietly celebrated the verdict as validation of their meticulous work. As for Noel Long, he left the courtroom in handcuffs, destined for prison as a convicted murderer and sex offender. Reports emerged that Gardaí were examining whether Long could be linked to other unsolved crimes from the past, now that they had his DNA profile officially identified. For the detectives who had pursued him for most of their working lives, the verdict in Nora Sheehan's case brought a long-awaited sense of closure. They had always believed that his capacity for extreme violence began long before 1981 and never truly ended, and then that for more than 40 years Noel Long had simply been getting away with it. Many spoke of his arrogance over the years, and of how he seemed so sure he would never be caught. For them, the guilty verdict was a moment of great relief. One retired officer would later tell the Irish Times, "When I got the call to say Long was convicted, I cried." There are many other stories for another day. The story of Nora Sheehan stands on its own as a testament to perseverance. Her family's unending persistence, the Gardaí's dedication, and the leaps in forensic science all combined to shine a light on a crime that had long been in the darkness. One of Nora's sons, speaking about his mother on RTE, described her as so gentle, she was always there for us. It was still heartbreaking that in her moment of need, trying to get home, she encountered pure evil on the road, and that no one was there for Nora in her moment of need. Yet in the end, an entire team of people was there for her, working across decades to speak for her and secure justice in her name. Nora Sheehan's case reminds us that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. It may take years or even generations, but with commitment, the truth can emerge. Nora's life was stolen, but her story was not forgotten. And now, finally, her story has an ending. The man who harmed her has been held accountable, and Nora's spirit can rest a little easier. Her name will be etched in time, and will stand as one of the longest and most remarkable quests for justice in Irish history. Thank you for listening to this episode of Lines of Inquiry. If you're listening on Spotify, please leave a comment on this episode and let us know what you think of the podcast. We now have an email address, linesofinquiry@goloudnow.com, and we would love to hear from you. So get in touch, whether you have a story you think we should cover or just want to let us know how you felt about an episode. That email is linesofinquiry@goloudnow.com. We really appreciate those who have taken time to give the podcast a review. With over 500 ratings on Spotify already, I am genuinely humbled by the support. Thank you. Your support helps us to tell these stories. If you haven't yet rated the podcast, I would be grateful if you could give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening, sharing it on your story on Instagram, or simply telling a friend that you're listening to the podcast. Make sure to like or follow the podcast in your podcast app, and hit the notifications button so you'll know every time a new episode is released. Lines of Inquiry is presented by me, John Sweetman. The podcast is created by Darren Cleary. Our executive producer is Eoin Brennan. Our producers are Siobhan Maguire and Siobhan Walsh. Sound editing and design are by Neil Kavanagh. with additional editing support from Ed Smith. Social media, marketing, video and legal support comes from the GoLoud team. This episode was written by Darren Cleary, with script editing from Eoin Brennan and myself. Join me next time as we open another case and follow the evidence wherever it leads. In the end, everything done in the dark comes to light.